Devon Jersild is a psychologist, a writer, and a psychotherapist in central Vermont. She has been associate editor at New England Review and associate director of the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Her book of nonfiction, Happy Hours: Alcohol in a Woman's Life, was widely acclaimed. Luminous Bodies is her first novel, and we are talking about Luminous Bodies in this interview. And the interview especially focuses on competition, achievement, ambition, and passion in women's lives. Hi, Devon.
Hi, Polly.
It's great to be here with you, and I'm really excited to talk with you about your new book, Luminous Bodies. And it's a novel about Marie Curie, her life, and it's in a fictional form. And it's beautifully written. I loved reading it. I hope lots of people run out and read it immediately. It will be great for the summer also, because it's very compelling. And the other thing I just want to say in general is that I think that it's an important book for women because it's really about, in my experience of the book, it's about women's complex relationships to ambition, competition among themselves, their relationships with men, their relationships to their own achievements. And from my point of view as a psychologist, I don't think that women have mastered these things in their new kind of domain in life, which is that we have lots of possibilities for achievement, ambition, leadership. And yet, I think many times we're coming from an old, let's say, an old paradigm. And the book really introduces that beautifully, I think. So welcome and thank you for being here. And let me know what you think about what I just said.
Well, thank you. I'm really, really happy to have this more in-depth conversation with you, Polly. And no, I agree. And I was thinking as you were speaking that when I wrote the novel, of course, it was intuitive and I wasn't thinking in theoretical terms or trying to make points in particular. I was just trying to write as deeply as I could, as truly as I could to how I imagined her experience. Um, but now thinking about it, looking back and looking at it and having discussions with women in book clubs, everything you say rings completely true.
Well, since you wrote the novel and you are a woman of this period of
Mm.
time, and I dare say you have many achievements and a lot of ambition too,
Mm.
I think that you're also probably expressing, your own perspective on the story. And that's the nature really of writing novels, it seems to me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes. I mean, of course, in creating the voice of Marie Curie, I did a lot of reading of her diaries, or letters when she was young, and her diaries a bit. She had a few diaries after the death of her husband, and did my best to kind of try to create a voice that was vital in the way she was vital, and a voice that seemed true to who she was. But of course, it's really a blending of my own voice and hers.
So, you're bringing up the issue of writing in your own voice, and this kind of translates into really the first thing I want to talk about, which I thought about only retrospectively when I was reading the book. I was very absorbed into the story. And then later I thought about some of the conditions that you must have experienced in writing the book. And one of the sort of biggest overview questions I have is what it was like to write a novel about a character who's already kind of outsized in terms of cultural and historical perspectives, especially for women. I mean, I grew up thinking that she was the first scientist that was a woman. And
Yeah.
I kind of knew her story, not really her real story. But so you're writing against this backdrop of a lot of narrative about Marie Curie and a lot
Yeah.
of other books. And so, what was the challenge for you in being able to kind of make this into the story you wanted to tell, or however you want to put that?
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you for asking that. I she was not only sort of outsized and idealized, but she's also kind of the sacred icon of science for women. and for everybody. And so I did feel that.
Mm.
I am not the first one to tell a story, a truer story about her. Other biographers have talked about her humiliation and the scandal, and tried to present her as more human. But what's really interesting to me is how persistent the cultural myth is, how it takes hold after, there might be a biography that breaks through, or a book that breaks through, and then we're right back to this sacred figure, this Madonna of science, sort of. Um,
Hmm.
so when I wrote about her and really wanted to present this combination of her courage and her strength and her vulnerability and what she suffered, I was anxious about doing that because I was always worried that it would come off as a kind of diminishment because people do want to idealize her. So I did feel like I was kind of walking a bit of a tightrope at times. Once I got into it, I kind of let it go. But I did sometimes feel that, especially in portraying the worst of her suffering and when her mind was quite disturbed. I worried about that. And
Could you just say a little more about that, her
mhm.
mind being disturbed? I mean, I want to talk about her relationships with the women in her life, but I don't know if you're speaking about her own distrust about the way she was exposed. And
Mm,
but if you could just talk a little bit about more about her mind being disturbed, and then I'd like to put this in the framework of, idealizing women
yeah,
also.
right. Well, her mind was I mean, she did suffer from depressions after every loss in her life. Her mother died when she was 10, but her mother had tuberculosis and was ill from the time Marie was probably around 5. She went away for a cure in Switzerland, left her family for a year. So Marie had this early loss, and she did just respond by crying, not being able to stop, staying in bed, and at many other points in her life, she would kind of collapse. So that was always kind of there, and she would recover and carry on. But what I'm really thinking of when I say her mind was really disturbed is after the public humiliation, when she was also very ill with a kidney disease. So she had a lot of stresses, and after the attacks in the press, she she left her daughters in Paris with a nanny, and she traveled under assumed names around France. She changed places. She became a bit paranoid, I think. And she was just actually near suicide. Her daughter Eve, who wrote the first very idealizing biography, does acknowledge that her mother's mind became very dark and that she was close to suicide. So that's the period I'm talking about.
So maybe if I want you to be able to control how much we tell of the story,
Yeah.
but I do think that you probably do need to give us the account of what the exposure was about, how it evolved, because even in talking about her relationships with the other women, that story is going to have to come out in the interview, I think.
Yes, yes, yes. And it's sort of on the book jacket too. So yes, the novel starts, I'll say, at probably the lowest point of Marie Curie's life. She has just been awarded a second Nobel Prize, but the Nobel Prize Committee is quietly trying to keep her from coming to pick it up, really wanting to take it away, saying that they shouldn't have awarded it to her because of this scandal that her letters to her lover, who's a married man, a physicist, have been published in the newspapers. There's been a mob outside her door throwing things at her, calling her names. The newspapers are being vicious. She's ill. So she leaves her home, as I just described, travels around, and then she winds up on the doorstep of her friend, the scientist Hertha Ayrton, an English suffragette. She goes to visit her in the south of England, and the last part of the novel is about her time there and her gradual healing, getting the strength and courage to come back to France and carry on with her life.
So I wonder if you could tell us why her affair, and if she had had a quiet affair and it had been discovered, possibly it still could have exposed her. But
Mm.
she had an affair with a famous scientist, and if you could just say who he is and what his relationship was to her husband as well, then I think we've got the
Yeah.
framework that.
Yes. I will say though that that the affair, even if he hadn't been a famous man, it was much worse because he was a famous man. But in France at that period, it was kind of okay to have affairs as long as they weren't found out. But as soon as they were found out, the scandal press, the
Mm,
scandal-driven press exposed people. There were stories of other suicides, people jumping off bridges when they were exposed in the press. So it was an
mm,
incredibly hypocritical time when it was both
mm,
okay and completely not okay, especially for a woman.
mm.
So it was a very scary time to be having an affair for a woman like Marie Curie.
Yeah,
Um,
and I imagine being a woman, I mean, now that you're mentioning it, the sort of uh, virgin whore split is especially difficult in the 19th century and then coming into
mm,
the 20th century, so that women were held to standards, I think, that were more sort of archetypal or mythological or simply prejudiced than
yeah,
men were held to. And so even though, you know, often men were assumed to be having affairs, of course, they'd be having affairs typically with women. And so the women might be really chastised and scandalized, but the men could sort of brush it off. And
yeah.
so I do think, you know, that the issues for women at this time were still pretty much in the 19th century puritanical framework. So even if it had been, I guess, a hidden affair, if she'd been found out, she would have been brought down.
You would have, and there's an issue of class here as well.
Mm.
So for a man to have an affair with mistresses who were below his social class was quite acceptable, but to have an affair with a woman of his own class was more outrageous and more threatening. So yeah, that is the background. But the man that she did have this affair with, an affair is a word I use because it's in common usage. But every time I do, when I think of her, I kind of cringe because she didn't think of it as an affair. She was in love with this physicist who had been a student of her husband's. And her husband loved him very much, and he loved her husband very much. They got together as a threesome many times during Marie's marriage to Pierre.
And by threesome, you do not mean
I
a
know.
sexual threesome. You
I
you mean in their friendship. And
Yeah, thank you for
yes.
clarifying. They'd get together and talk of an evening and with other people.
Right.
So, and Pierre, or not Pierre, Paul Langevin was a mathematician, younger than Marie by I think 4, 5, 6 years, and brilliant, a physicist as well. And he uh, had a very troubled, tumultuous marriage and came to Marie Curie sort of for solace and comfort.
So in
And
a sense, he also initiated it.
oh yes,
And
yeah,
and she was her husband, she was a widow, so she wasn't really having an affair. He was having the affair,
right,
but
right,
because it was public and because she was the one that was scandalized, I mean, he was scandalized too, but it passed as I understood it, you know.
right.
But because she was scandalized, she was seen as having an affair, even though, and for me, this is one of the issues that sort of is an issue often for women. The woman is often blamed, even if she actually is not having the affair. I've noticed this with, you know, in doing therapy with people who know about an affair. Sometimes it's a woman who knows, sometimes it's a man who knows, but the woman is singled out, often to blame first
Absolutely, yeah.
before the man. Like
And
the
that's still
woman,
the case.
that's still the case.
Yeah,
And so the woman is seen as breaking up a marriage or, you know, breaking down the family, whereas maybe the man initiated it,
yeah,
but the woman is the one who is sort of most culpable. And I think, again, it's because of these kind of universal images we have of women, this sort of archetype, you know, either you're wonderful and you're lovely and you're sort of virginal or you're a bitch or a witch or a whore or something. And so it's hard to imagine women in complex ways, I think.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really true.
And so Paul Langevin was also well known in the public, wasn't he? I mean, fairly well
Yes,
known.
he was fairly well known, not nearly as well known as Marie Curie because of her Nobel Prize, and her relationship with her husband Pierre was very idealized in the press. And she had been in the press before the scandal broke. She allowed her name to be put in for the Academy of Science in France. And at that time, um, women weren't even allowed to step into the building, not
Mm.
at all. And her colleagues encouraged her. She had similar accolades from other countries, but not France. She was having this relationship with Paul Langevin at this time that this happened, and she decided to go ahead and allow this to happen. Um, and uh, and people at first were the press was treating her as this Madonna of science again. It was just all about her loveliness, this grieving widow, making her out to be this beautifully feminine scientist who was grieving and taking care of her daughters and who was brilliant. And then and then there was some competition from a man who wasn't nearly the scientist that Marie Curie was. And he won. Well, first of all, they had to. There, it's a more complicated story. I won't say, but in the end, this man won, and she did not. And the press turned on her then,
Mm.
and said that she had an appetite for for attention and
Mhm.
for rewards and awards that was very unbecoming. And the press and people have become hostile to her. So this was in the newspapers. She had already been humiliated in the press, and turned against and called terrible things before the affair with Paul Langevin broke. So it was a pretty much a double whammy, and people were ready to pounce on her.
And so, really, this again, this idea of an ambitious woman
Yeah.
is part of the stereotype, also.
Yes.
It's like women cannot have ambitions and authority without being stereotyped and demeaned, even now.
Yeah.
It's not as though we've transcended all of that. And of course, when Marie Curie she was, sort of taking on the territory. And I love the letter that she wrote to I guess it was the chair of the Nobel Committee that you quoted in the novel. I assume it is
Yes.
accurate, in which
Yes.
she says more or less, I will be coming for my Nobel Prize no matter what you think, because I know my science is good and it
Mm.
shouldn't be interactive with my private life. And the fact that she says, I'm coming for it. I've read those lines to women in therapy. You know,
Mm.
you should know what you know,
Mm.
and you should know what you do well. And
Yeah.
if you don't know, other people won't know,
Yeah.
because it's very easy to let go of it if you have ambitions or achievements, because others aren't going to be applauding you for
Right.
that, not men and not women. And the fact that she said that and did that is so remarkable. And
Yeah.
could you just talk about that a little bit? And
Yes. Yes. Because although Marie Curie had her periods of self-doubt and guilt, I don't think she ever doubted the quality of her work or the strength of her mind. So she had that in a way that really is breathtaking and really such a good example for all of us to have that kind of courage and strength and to stand behind it and be willing to fight for it. She was very sick. This was shortly before she collapsed and went to the hospital for 3 months. She still went to Stockholm to pick up that prize because she wanted to
yes.
defend her reputation.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah.
in that way, she defended the reputation of all women who have achievement. It's because I believe that there's a tendency to think that somehow it's more modest or polite to have other people approve of you if you're a
Mhm.
woman,
Yeah.
instead of feeling confident.
Yeah.
But she really showed that kind of confidence that's
Yeah.
unusual.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can share that one of the things that drew me to the book was the question of how she developed that. What was it that gave her that courage and that confidence to be a woman in a public space and to claim her authority with such confidence? And I really think of it as being, well, there are many parts to it, but she grew up in Poland, um, and she was born just a few years after the 1863 um, January uprising, when 9,000 Poles with scythes rebelled against, I think it was 80 or 90,000 Russian soldiers. So they were completely crushed. And the Poles who didn't already know this finally came to understand that violence was never going to save them. And so they really put their,
Hooray.
yeah, right,
Right.
right. They really, this
Right.
is a huge for Marie
Yeah.
Curie. It
Yeah.
was huge, and it was, we'll talk later about her relationship to the suffragette movement as a result, but it was huge for her. And but what they did do is they put their faith in education, and they believed in, they were really positivist. Marie considered herself a positivist, meaning that she believed in the equality of all people, including peasants, Jewish people, and women. And also that education, sort of these slow increments of increased knowledge, would be the best hope that Poland had. So there was quite a bit of the Polish population that really believed this. And as a result, girls were respected. They were expected to be educated, and they weren't sort of just like fulfilling themselves. They were doing this because they had a duty to advance knowledge, to improve the world, and ultimately to liberate Poland. So Marie Curie grew up with something that I didn't have actually, being born almost, 100 years later. She had a context in which her mind was taken seriously, very seriously, and she was expected to work hard and to contribute. And that, that gave her it gave her a sense of purpose. It gave her something to fall back on when she was at her lowest, that she had the moral satisfaction, at least, of being useful. And it gave her something that she had internalized as a child that I think is still kind of rare. Just that complete sense that she was the equal of she had a brother, and it was still the 19th century. There was still plenty of sexism. The money that was left in the family went to her brother's education, not the sisters, but the father really wanted to educate his daughters, really worked hard to make that happen. So she had a great benefit that I think it's hard to overestimate, of believing from the time she was young that other people also respected her mind.
Yes, well, she had that reflected back, I guess, especially from her father.
Mm,
And in that way, she has a bit of what the Jungians would call the father's daughter rather
hmm
than the mother's daughter.
mm,
That the father is reflecting her strength rather than the mother reflecting her strength. And in that way, I think her father was invested in her being educated,
yeah.
and he was pleased also for her achievements.
Yes, he was. And her mother also was a strong woman who ran the most elite girls' school in Warsaw. She hired people, she fired people, she was very respected, and she expected her daughters to excel. So she didn't have her mother alive, and who knows how that would have gone. But she certainly had the example of her mother, and of other women.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that her mother is in the background there, but because she died young,
Yes.
then, I mean, I have to say that the setup is reminiscent. My literary agent was Jill Nerum. She's died a couple of years now. Um, but her mother died young, and she was raised by men. She was raised by her father and her uncle.
Hmm.
And I felt, even in talking to her, her tremendous confidence in her abilities. She went to Radcliffe. I mean, she also suffered a lot from the loss, but there was a way that her voice was so confident. And, I do think that, I mean, I thought about that when I was reading the novel, about how the father did play a role.
Yeah, yeah.
And you said it was different than what you had in growing up.
Yes, it was. And interesting, you're reminding me, in speaking about your agent, that in when I was in graduate school for my doctorate in psychology, my dissertation was about women who had been raised by very strong mothers,
Hmm.
who had a public place in the world. And I had to figure out how to measure that, so I measured their income as compared to the father's income. And so they had either kind of an equal or strong income to the father's. And uh, and then I interviewed the women without telling them exactly what I was looking for, but just wanting to hear about their lives, and what their ambitions were, what they did in the world. And this was 25 years ago. I think things have changed, and I interviewed women who were at least 40, so that they were in the middle of their lives. So this is a different generation. But what I found is that the women, in talking about their role models, it was still the father who
Mm,
represented agency in the outside world.
mm,
It was very clear. One
mhm.
journalist who sat at her father's desk and looked up her father was also a journalist, and she looked at this map and saw the highest place on the map and the lowest place in the map, and she was so excited by it and became just like her father. Or even then, the mother, who was much more famous than the father, wasn't quite the model.
Yeah, well, again, kind of going back to these prejudices or archetypes or stereotypes, they do form a lot of our unconscious context in looking at the individual. We make assumptions about them because of the stereotypes, but maybe we don't even know that we are making the assumption or that it's a stereotype. Or,
Right.
it just seems to be the truth. And I do think that the framework again for being a woman is changing in our period of time, but the a lot of the issues that Marie Curie experienced have not fully become conscious to
Yeah.
women now. So this gives me an opportunity to shift over to the issues of her relationships with women. And this is one way the novel I felt really was so emotionally effective for me. I could identify with all of the different positions that the
Mhm.
women are in.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you want to talk first. I would like to hear about Jeanette Langevin. I would like to hear about Hertha Ayrton, and then also about her relationship with her daughters. And so, it's I think the three women that sort of make up the novel, though, are Jeanette, Hertha, and Marie Curie. And,
Mhm.
and they shift around almost like a triangle of feelings.
Mhm.
And so if you would first, well, you can start with whichever one you want to, but I was a bit fascinated by the Marie Curie's feelings about Jeanette. And then, of course, Jeanette is radically hostile. So if you would talk about how you're affected by that relationship, maybe, and why you wrote it the way you did and how close that was to what
Yeah.
you would take to be the story as you read about it or whatever.
Yeah. Talk about a tightrope in writing about Jeanette Langevin. Her real name, by the way, was Emma Jean, but I use Jeanette for various reasons. So she was the wife of Paul Langevin. She came from a lower social class, and she was married and had 4 or 5 children. So she did not have any income apart from what she had from her husband. So she was in that vulnerable position that women were in. And she was fun for me to write too because she's kind of a life force.
Yes.
She's really vital.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and she was kind of could be funny and could be sort of just she could be warm and connected and very sort of appealingly female, and that's part of what Marie Curie, responds to also. She's kind of taken into this sort of feminine world of her being solicitous and flattering to a degree and funny and just herself. So that's Jeanette.
So I really did love that part of their relationship because Marie Curie is missing a mother,
Yes.
and Jeanette really is a mother. She's like mother writ large,
Hmm.
with the babies as also the babies and the breasts and the bonnets and the flowery skirts and so on. I mean, it's all
Yeah.
sort
The
of
pink.
the pink, yeah. So I don't know if that's the way she was or the way she's written, but it's very convincing
Uh-huh.
to me that she's attractive. And she's attractive also to someone who hasn't had much mothering or hasn't felt mothered very much. And
Right.
and so, attractive. And then also, I think that attraction to this sort of motherly, feminine mother will also evoke competition in the woman who is more the like sort of ambitious, accomplished in the world type of woman in the period of time that we're in still. Yeah.
Right, right. It's interesting you say that. I think you're right. And um What I was more conscious of was that Marie Curie felt superior to Jeanette, and she had equality with Jeanette's husband, and she was also attractive, and especially when before her husband died, when she had more life force herself. So I thought of her as being kind of feeling superior to her, but of course that superiority is a defense. Um,
Yes.
yeah, right.
Yes, yes, based on envy, I would say typically,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
there would be some envy of her, but especially after her husband died and Jeanette had this thriving, bustling, joyous family, although it was more complicated than that, of course. Right. So, um,
Doesn't Marie Curie mention breast size earlier
yes,
before that, even that she,
yes, she
she's,
does.
yes, yeah, that was interesting to me that she was predicting, forecasting that Paul Langevin was going to. I wondered how you came up with that or what you were.
That was fun. This is early in the novel when Marie is and Pierre are just courting, but Paul Langevin is like sort of puppy dog, excited young man who loves her husband, and she's attracted to the energy between her husband and Paul Langevin, the way they really are so open in their affection for each other. Um, and but she's not having fantasies about him sexually or anything, or not sort of falling in love with him, but she's still interested in his vitality. And at one moment, she just has this brief fantasy, yes, that he's going to go to England where he's studying and marry a woman selling potatoes with large breasts. And yeah, I think I don't know how it came up. It just came up as what her fantasy might have been in the moment, and also to kind of suggest that aura of sexuality and vitality that ultimately will get developed between the two of them.
Well,
Yeah,
and that sexuality, vitality is a theme through the novel.
yeah,
And I assume it's connected to the title, Luminous Bodies.
yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah. The title is. I was attracted to the title because I was attracted to the imagery of something that shines from within. And radium isn't technically a luminous body, but when Marie Curie was working on it, she nobody knew where the energy of radium came from. Of course, did it come from outside? Did it come from inside? And so this becomes symbolic also of Marie's relationship to her energy and vitality. Where does that come from? Is it something that she carries with her, or is it something that she creates in relationship to other people or to her work? And what does it mean to be attracted to other people sexually and otherwise? And what's the energy there? Yeah.
So, you've mentioned now several times that Paul Langevin was very much connected, looking up to um, Marie Curie's husband. And I don't think you were suggesting, at least I didn't get any suggestion of that being really homoerotic. But were you thinking along those lines? I didn't get that from
No.
the story, but just now when you were talking about it, I was
Yeah.
wondering if that was.
No, I don't think it was homoerotic. But I guess I kind of feel that our libidos are, including a bit of our sexuality, is present in any intense relationship between women, between men, between both sexes, no matter what their orienting sexuality is. So, there's some of that, but I'm not meaning it to be homoerotic in particular or threatening in any sense that way.
Yeah, I didn't pick it up like that. And I
Yeah.
think also that the anything that's intellectual, academic, or scientific has an erotic aspect in
Yes,
it.
yes, yes.
Because it's very exciting.
Yes, even, devotion to science is
Yeah,
has an erotic aspect to it. Yeah.
right, right. So then as things develop between Marie and Jeanette, um, tell me what the way that you see the story developing and why it becomes so focal for Marie's life then, and really the
Hmm.
outplaying of her, let's say, destiny, you know.
Right, right. I'm remembering and having you mention that early moment with Marie imagining the his future wife's breast. I'm remembering that Marie Curie had a crush on the same young student of her father's that her sister did. And that was a source of real rivalry. So there's this sort of predating kind of structure in her mind. But uh, it becomes focal in just sort of a plot sense here, because Paul Langevin is having such trouble with his wife, who does become violent and screams a lot and is very unstable and very crude. It ends up that she had moments like this from the time they were married, and he had a very unhappy marriage. So when she's consoling Paul and they're starting to have this relationship, she's in this tricky position. What she really believed, consciously, what she really believed was that he was living in a toxic environment and that it was bad for him, bad for the whole family, and it was keeping him from doing the work that he was alive to do. So, and that's very, very important to her for many reasons. So she
Mhm.
really felt that it was her duty and her moral obligation, as well as something that benefited her, to save him from this marriage.
Mhm.
She really believed that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there was reason to, I mean, she had lots of reasons to believe it that way. So then, of course, once she tried to be very respectful of the position that Jeanette Langevin was in, but she also knew that she was manipulative and also that she was powerless and that she would do anything she could to keep her husband. And then when Jeanette became, more irrational, more erratic, and more dangerous in the way she was behaving, the competition became fierce, and Marie really just looked at her as, pretty evil.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that I could feel in the story sympathy on both sides. I mean, I
Hmm.
could see that I felt that it was outrageous what Jeanette Langevin did to Marie Curie. On the other hand, Jeanette Langevin did not have a future beyond her marriage, and she knew what the rules of the game are in
Yeah.
regard to having so many children and also being so dependent. And ultimately, and what about the duel? I mean, did Paul Langevin really do that? Or was
He,
that part of it?
he really did.
Oh, could you just say a moment about that? Because that's also seemed to me to be sort of ridiculously male,
Yeah. Yeah.
in this pretentious kind of we're going to fight this out sort of thing, and then it's
Yes.
not.
And
Yes.
Marie Curie, I actually, I guess I don't know exactly what she felt, but in the novel, I have her feeling the same way you did, in reading it. Yes, duels were still pretty common at that time,
Mm.
and in France, and laughed at in much of the rest of the world. But they were still pretty common in France. And Paul Langevin, who also came from a more working class background. So when he came to as a student to Pierre Curie, he was this sort of rough, less finished kind of guy who then became very urbane and civilized. And so when he was challenged in the press, he was what was he was called names in the press, like I think that he was said to be hiding behind Marie Curie's skirts and sort of insulted in his manlyhood, and he in his manhood, and so he challenged this guy to a duel, and
Yeah.
and it actually happened, and he got a second to come, and but then then the journalist ended up like dropping his gun and saying, "I can't shoot the most brilliant man in France. I can't deprive France of this guy." But they acted it out, and it was in all the papers, and there were other duels as well
Other duels, you mean
around
that?
Marie Curie, yeah, not with Paul Langevin, but other people
Hmm,
involved in
hmm.
publishing the scandal challenged each other and had there was at least three or four duels.
My gosh.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the musical Hamilton. It's
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
there'll be a musical around
Yeah.
that.
But it
That
does show the
yeah,
rigidity of the gender roles.
yeah, yeah. And the fact also that it's a dramatic sort of playing out of something, but very often people did not shoot each other in duels.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. By
they
that
sort of
time, they often
they
didn't.
played them out, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, I took it in the story that the whole scandal is less harmful to Paul Langevin ultimately than it
Absolutely.
is to Marie Curie. But
Absolutely. He
yeah,
didn't almost lose his job.
right, right.
He didn't get, I mean, Marie Curie was not invited into bourgeois homes for a long stretch.
Hmm.
She was really ostracized. It was very dangerous to her. Her boss, let's say, the dean at the Sorbonne, the dean of science, who had been her advocate. And
Hmm.
this is very painful because he had been her advocate in very important ways. He'd been the one to come and tell her that her husband had died. So he was very intimate and her ally with in terms of her application to the Academy of Science. And he's the one who says he can't protect her and she might lose her job.
Yeah, yeah. Again, it's because you have to kind of think that her image has changed.
Yeah.
It's the image that's changed now, and we can't undo that change. And so, again, if she had not stood up for herself and gone for her second Nobel Prize, she might really have not received it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely true.
yeah,
If she had received the first letter or two that she got from the Nobel Prize chair and backed down a bit, they would have jumped on it.
yeah, yeah. She would have just collapsed into the stereotypes,
Yeah,
and everybody would have felt a little bit pleased,
yeah, yeah.
that they did the right thing.
Yep, yep. She was
Yeah.
put in place.
Right. And so now I want to talk about Hertha. Is it Hertha or Hertha?
It seems to be pronounced both ways. I'm not really sure what she would have called herself. It,
Okay.
yeah, it comes from she named herself after the goddess of health and healing. Her friends actually, her real name was Sarah Phoebe or Phoebe Sarah, and her friends started calling her Hertha after the Swinburne poem, and
Hmm.
because she was so nurturing, and
Hmm.
she then claimed that name for herself.
So let's talk about her and how she comes into play and her scientific achievements, and then feminism and the suffragettes and how that intersects or interacts with Marie Curie. And then if we can come back to the way that Jeanette plays a role in this as a kind of backdrop
Mm,
to,
yeah,
what the story is for women like Hertha and Marie. They have other options.
yeah. Yeah. So Hertha Ayrton was born to a Polish immigrant father and a mother in London, and she was the oldest of, I think there were a lot of children, I think maybe seven, and her father died young, and so her mother was a single mother, not with any means. She had to work, and Hertha took care of, from the age of seven, took care of younger children during the day. But her mother like Marie's mother, was a very strong advocate for women's education. And so Hertha did go to Girton College. She had an advocate who was Barbara Bodichon, who was a kind of philanthropist and took Hertha on and helped support her and encouraged her. And she became uh, a scientist. She was very sort of multifaceted. She was an engineer and a physicist and a mathematician, an inventor. She married a scientist, Will Ayrton, and whereas Marie and Pierre Curie collaborated with each other, he always said to her that if we collaborate, I'll get all the credit.
Hmm.
So he didn't want to collaborate with her. So
Because he didn't want to overshadow
he
her.
did not want to overshadow her.
Right.
So both these women, by the way, had incredibly supportive husbands, and without that, they would not have been where they became,
Yes.
would not gotten where they did. And so she invented, she did a lot of important research on sand ripples. And she studied them. She went to the beach and just studied these in terms of, the physics of the motions of the waves and the formation of the sand ripples. And before that, she found a way, she was studying the electric arc. There were lamps around all through London that were hissing and spitting, and she figured out what the problem was and fixed it, and all the lamps were changed. So she had some innovations there. She was, I believe, nominated to be part of a fellow of the Royal Society, which is the highest society in Britain. But she was declined. She was refused because she wasn't a full citizen as a woman. Because she was a married woman, she wasn't really considered a full person. She was the property of her
Hmm.
husband, essentially.
Hmm.
And so they said we can't give it to her because she's not really a full human being. That's
Hmm.
not the words that wasn't the word they used, but that's what it really meant. So she was denied that. She had articles rejected because of, as punishment, she felt for her activities on behalf of women. So she and Marie had a lot in common.
So her activities involved understanding the issues about not being a full human being, which I think many women do not recognize still how late this was in the history of civilization.
Yes.
You know, that women weren't recognized. They couldn't have sovereignty. They couldn't vote because
Mhm.
they weren't recognized as being full human beings.
Yeah.
And it was essentially because of stereotypes that occurred kind of late in history, because really earlier, prior to the 19th century, the stereotypes between about the two sexes and what the two sexes meant weren't as strong and, let's say, um, uh, what would be the word, convincing,
Mhm.
for
It's sort of
people.
arguments that got developed theoretically.
That's right. They got developed theoretically, then they got developed biologically, then there are all sorts of Darwinian supports for them. I mean, there are lots of things that have happened that appear to be scientific, that appear to be spiritual, that appear to
Yeah.
be, rational, that have to do simply with prejudice about these two categories of being human.
Yes.
And so, only really late, very late, does this come about in the suffragette movement that women are beginning to see very clearly that they're not being understood as
Mhm.
human beings. And and Marie Curie did not, she didn't join right away. I mean, she joined as, I was wondering if you would just say how she got to know Hertha or
Mhm.
Hertha, and then how she came around to supporting the causes
Mhm.
of the
Right.
suffragettes. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I want to back up a little bit and say that because part of positivism was belief in the equality of women and working for
Mm,
women, Marie Curie did believe in equal rights and was a feminist of her own variety from early on. But in Poland, that meant something very different from what it meant in many other countries because it was inseparable from the cause of national freedom. And so it was very practical and it was not a separate thing. It wasn't as much about the rights of women and in the
mm,
abstract. It was sort of it was sort of more embedded in the whole movement toward freedom for Poland from Russian occupation. So
mm,
Marie Curie believed in the equal rights of women and spoke about it. Um, but her path was to put her head down and do the work that she was born to do, which was to be a scientist. And I think that, at least the way I write her, and, I imagine this was true, but this is my invention, that she did have the fantasy that doing the work, doing brilliant work, would put her a bit beyond, it would make things less dangerous for her. That her brilliance would protect her, that she wasn't at risk of being exposed and humiliated and
mm,
kicked out if she was that good of a scientist and that brilliant. And she was also just so obsessed with her work and having children and being married that she didn't have time for much else. So, that was the path she took. And I think from the beginning, she admired Hertha Ayrton and the work that she did on behalf of women, but it wasn't her path. And in the novel, it becomes a source of friction between the two of them. I also want to differentiate between, in Britain, the suffragist movement was came first, and it was fighting for the equal rights of women, but definitely eschewing any form of violence. And when that didn't work after a very long time, the suffragette movement developed, which did use arson, did break windows, etc. And Hertha Ayrton was part of that latter group, the suffragette movement. And that's what the friction is in the novel, that Marie Curie just says, people think that you can use violence and things will get better. People think that things are insupportable and something has to change. So something dramatic has to happen to make it change because it cannot be borne any longer. And Marie Curie's point of view is it can always get worse. And when you use
hmm.
violence, it can get worse because that's what she learned growing up in Poland. So
Right.
she was very against the violence. And in my novel, which is definitely, this part is invented, I have Hertha Ayrton offended and arguing with Marie Curie about this.
Well, I think that that is part of the argument about feminism and has been in the United States as well. Like how does one carry out equal rights? Do you carry it out by suppressing or attacking or whatever the other side?
Hmm.
Do you have to, like the New Yorker cartoon, it's not enough that dogs win, cats must lose. That's a sort of attitude that includes violence often towards the other side. But
Yeah.
then the other way of looking at it is more or less what you're having Marie Curie voice, which is it's knowledge. It's
Hmm.
knowledge all the way down. And
Hmm.
without the knowledge, nothing changes.
Yeah.
It's just what changes is that things flip. So now what was sort of the upper hand is now the lower hand, and then so it's sort of the top dog and the underdog. And I think that, at least in the novel, you have Mary Curie defending the idea that knowledge is what will make the change, not violence. Uh,
Yes.
and
Yes,
then,
definitely
yes.
respect. Yeah.
And Hertha, though, is sort of sympathetic, but also sort of, it seems like feeling like that's a little naive on the part of Marie Curie.
Hmm.
And I think about, in this period of time, all of the issues that surround how are we going to move forward out of polarization and will it take violence? And again, women often aren't articulating these two positions like the women are in the novel. I mean, I think they're implied sometimes, but
Yes, yes, yeah.
um,
Right, absolutely.
uh, and
My
then
mind,
yes, go ahead. Yeah.
well, my mind's returning to the question you asked about Hertha and the sort of Hertha, Marie, and Jeanette group triangle of women, and um, and Hertha's perspective there. And this was another sort of tightrope for me in writing the novel that I did want to honestly convey the sort of level to which Jeanette Langevin did sink, without making her into the villain of the story.
Yeah.
I wanted to be able to convey Marie Curie's, hatred of her for a period at least, um, and still not make Jeanette fully the villain. And so I do that in a couple of ways. But one of the ways I do that is through Hertha's engagement in the subject with Marie. And Marie knows these things that Hertha is saying to her, but they need to be said nonetheless, which is, what opportunities does this woman have? And it's, she has no education and she's suffering too. And this is basically what happens. And this is what happens among women because of patriarchy, because of because everybody living under patriarchy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have Hertha saying it in a way that um, is, I think, proletariat, in a way that is also makes the proletariat position very attractive.
Mhm.
It's understandable. And it really is understandable what happened with Jeanette, and she doesn't have the choices.
Right.
On the other hand, what, what she does to Marie Curie, um, I mean, I think you write the three of them very well. And so, I can sense that, at least the way that I read the story, Hertha doesn't quite get the whole thing.
Hmm.
She gets the part of defending Jeanette, but
Hmm.
she doesn't quite empathize with Marie either.
Hmm. Hmm. That's true. That's true. Um, that's really true and interesting. You know, um, I think what's hard to really take in from where we stand today is that, for Jeanette Langevin and for almost all women, their dependence on a man is a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really about survival. And so, one of the ways I try to convey this too is, and I have to say, I got this from, I loved, one of my favorite parts of researching the book was reading novels that Marie Curie would have read and loved.
Hmm.
And one of them was by a great feminist Polish writer, Eliza Oreszkowa.
Hmm.
And she wrote a book called Marta. among many other books. And in this book, there's a woman who's, as a sort of a high school student, is rosy and pretty, and she leaves school early. Um, Now I'm going to mix up what I invented and what's in the novel.
Mm,
But more or less, this woman gets married to a man who has some money, is earning some money, but they don't save anything. Her father has some money, but he loses it and he dies young. Then her husband dies young.
mm,
And this woman is reduced to living in, the tenement houses in the poorest part of Warsaw, leaving her little baby alone while she goes out to work as a seamstress. And ultimately, she basically starves to death, and she can't be the things that Marie Curie could be because she wasn't a good enough student to be a governess, and
mm,
she wouldn't couldn't work in the stores because people wanted men to wait on them, and one by one she couldn't live in as a maid because no one wanted her child, so she basically died of starvation with her kid, is I think what happens in the novel. And so I have a flashback in the novel that's just a very brief little interstitial little vignette between chapters where Marie, who did go read to women who were in these sewing factories. She would go and read to them. She would teach them how to read. So I have this little moment where she has a classmate that she goes to visit, and she has the story like Marta of being reduced in her circumstances terribly. And I did that to kind of show, I tried with images to connect her to Jeanette so the reader could feel it's
mm.
desperate. It's absolutely desperate. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think you did a great job of it. I mean, I think the issue then about Marie is it's hard for Herta to really empathize with Marie because she's kind of an N of one at
Hmm.
that point. There aren't others like her.
Hmm.
She's achieved at a level that's almost unimaginable for women. And so then another woman probably can't empathize easily with that, partly because of the envy, which I think is almost always an issue when people feel that there's someone who's got higher status and they can't get that status,
Hmm.
that there's envy. And so there's a desire to put them down slightly also. And so I think Hertha feels that with Marie, and you kind of get to that uh, by also her reflections on Jeanette. And then you get to the complexity of all this by reading the books that Marie Curie might also have read and
Hmm.
been influenced by in her way of thinking herself through her own life.
Hmm.
And so that I want to talk about our daughters, but I'm going to bring in the another topic before I do, which is the way you learned about the science, because I was very impressed with the reality. At least I don't know that much about the science of radiation, but it sounded good. Everything seemed to
Hmm.
make sense, and I thought, well, how much did you learn about the science of radiation, and how did you do that? Were you studying it, or So if you could just talk about, I mean, when you said you read the books that she likely read, I wondered, well, did that also involve reading some of the scientific books, or were you reading things that, anyway, how did you learn the science?
Well, that was a steep learning curve because I don't have a background in laboratory science, and I was intimidated by it, and I put it off. I
Mm,
put off trying to learn, and I had to do a lot of sort of remedial work to understand even some basic concepts. But I knew that she was so passionate about it that I had to really, and I wanted to capture her passion for science because it's so much a part of who she was and her exhilaration in the scientific experiments. So I had to do a lot of basic learning, reading textbooks and trying to understand. And my learning isn't deep. Um, I'm relieved to understand that many historical novelists say this, that they observe vast tons of material and then they kind of forget it as they move on. But I learned what I had to do, and what I had to learn in order to make this convincing. But I have to say that when I turned this in to my agent several years ago, and it was almost ready to be sent out, she told me that she could feel Marie's passion and love for in every area except for in the science.
Hmm.
And I'm very grateful to her for that because I took it back. I knew I couldn't let it go out into the world without that. So I dug in a lot deeper at that point. And
Hmm.
I did find, it took a while, but I found a textbook that was published in German and English and Russian and French and Marie probably would have been reading it in, I think, Russian at the time, and that she followed to do her experiments.
Huh.
And it gave me all these lovely physical details, like, how to use a blowpipe without dislocating your jaw, and, what the flame looked like in the blowpipe and how it turned colors with different elements and how
Hmm.
you knew and under different conditions what you were looking at and what materials that she used and had on hand. And I also did research. I finally found an article that Marie Curie wrote herself about one of her later experiments. And I got a little bit more of the sense of, what the stakes were, what the questions were, what her worries were, about contaminating her radiation sample. I did research about, the laboratory, the one that would have smelled like, hot iron and soot and, all these particulars that
Hmm.
novelists need to make something come alive. What do you see?
Right.
What do you hear? What do you touch? What do you smell? So I really dived into it once my agent had given me that feedback, and now it's one of the parts of the novel I'm proudest of because people do say what you did that it just does come to life and you can feel her exhilaration.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like I could also feel her love for science,
Yeah.
and and I could also sense, because to me, what would have been maybe previously sort of a prejudice on my part would be that she'd fallen in love with Pierre and then fallen in love with science.
Ah,
That it was that was not what was happening.
right, right. That was
And
not.
it was almost as though he fell in love. Maybe I don't know if this is in your story or the fact that he fell in love with the science as a result of falling in love with her.
Okay. I think they had both already fallen in love with science, but he did fall in love with her in part because she was in love with science. He had despaired of finding a woman that he could love. And when he met Marie Curie, it was very quick that he was in love with her, and they were really a tight unit, working together for as long as he was alive.
But what I meant, and maybe I wasn't clear, is that he fell in love with the science of radiation because of her, rather than
Oh,
her falling in love with that
oh no,
particular.
absolutely. Yes.
Because I think in my mind I had it the other way from my,
Oh, I see.
yeah,
No, yeah, no,
yeah,
she's the one who chose for her dissertation to study. He was studying crystals
right,
and some other other phenomena. And she was studying radiation. But when she got to a point in her work where it could not be done with only one person, she needed someone else. It was part of his love for her to put away his crystals and join her in this effort. But she was the one who drove it. And at certain points, he thought, "This is enough. Let's pull back." And she did not want to pull back.
right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, there was a lot of sort of physical challenge
Yeah.
in discovering what they discovered because they had to take it on
Yeah.
physically. And I guess also I wonder from the story, are we meant to think that he was ill with radiation illness, even though he died from an accident?
I think so.
Okay.
It seems to me that I haven't really read much about this, but I know that he was limping and
Mhm.
had a lot of back pain and bone pain, and that is a result of radiation sickness.
Mhm.
So his physical ailments really could have been related to the exposure to radium and to radioactivity. And then, he was not paying attention. He tripped and fell in front of a wagon that ran him over. It could have happened even if he didn't have bone pain and didn't limp. But in the story, I kind of do imply that maybe that was part of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's the way I was understanding it. And I think it's reasonable
Mm.
because I think there was no knowledge of what was going to later become very clear
Yes.
about the harms
Yes.
of being so exposed to radiation also.
Right.
Um, and I know that I don't know, but maybe you thought of this consciously, maybe it unconsciously was the case that that there were the harms that they were both exposed to through their love for each other and their love for science um, were harms that have to do with exposure being,
Yeah.
they were exposed to the radiation, but then she was exposed to the public for this scandal, and they were both exposed out of love. I mean,
Yes.
that she really loved Paul Langevin as well as Pierre, and they loved the science, and it wasn't as though anybody was just after fame or wealth or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yes, you know that an earlier title of the novel had been Exposure or something like this. Right. And that's a nice way of framing it. That exposure, that vulnerability to another person and to pain and suffering, because of your willingness to be exposed.
Right, right. And the
Yeah.
sacrifice of love. I
That's
mean, if you lo they loved their science, they loved actually studying radium,
mm-hmm.
they really loved it. And they kind of, the way you express it, they sort of love the experience of actually seeing this energy
Yes, yes.
that no one had seen.
They were thrilled. They were so thrilled by it. Marie used to tell the story of early on when they first had radium within, its various mixtures in vials in their sort of old shed, drafty old shed. And she would tell the story of one night um, going back home and going to sleep. They have a little girl at that time, and Pierre's father is living with them, helping care for the little girl. And after dinner, even though they'd been working these long days, she wanted to go back and look at it in the dark. So
Yeah.
off they go, and they open the door and they don't turn on the light, and all these sort of little blue vials are glowing around the shed. And she loved to tell that story. It was a kind of love.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine,
Yeah, yeah,
that because it's fascinating and they're not sure what it is. They have no explanation really
right,
for
right.
it. And so it's like anything else that, you're fascinated by a new reality, and it is love,
Yeah,
and then they love each other so much, but then she also loves Paul Langevin. And
yes,
I think he loves her from your story, at least.
I think so too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of my readers don't think so, but I think so.
Yeah, I thought so anyway. And so then, about the daughters, because often again, if we think about women, and mothers and daughters are not easy with each other typically. And sometimes that's why I think when the mother, I don't want to say this in a way that I was just about to say it, but when the mother disappears when the daughter is young, sometimes the daughter is freer to develop her ambition because the mother's not competing with her, so to speak. Um, but here Marie Curie has two girls, and the lots of things that even from the beginning of the novel, the daughters are there, but they seem to be neglected or something, when they're with her. So I wanted to know if you would just talk about the way you saw the daughters in the novel, and then I know, and that's in the postscript, I think that they grow up as well. I mean, they had different kinds of outcomes, but um, that they were successful in their lives. And if you would just talk about the influence in the novel, the way you're thinking about them in regard to, Marie Curie's life and her ambitions and her love for science, and then also the scandal that everyone is exposed to.
Yeah, yeah. Writing about Marie Curie's mothering was another big challenge because I did not want to make her into a 21st century American mom. I wanted her to be who she was, and she wasn't even a French mother. She was a Polish mother in terms of her own child raising methods. And that comes off as very chilly to most readers. And there was a version that I had of that chilliness that actually made it impossible for people to keep reading the novel. They just took against
Mm.
her. So
Oh,
I had to work with that and try to translate it to keep a bit of that feeling, but still convey the passionate love she also had for her daughters, which I believe was very real and very deep. So that was challenging in itself. But in terms of the children, Irene was, let's see, she must have been about 7 or something like that when her father died. So she had 7 years of living with a very happy mother, and a very happy father. She might have been neglected by some people's accounts, but she had her grandfather who also adored her and took
Hmm.
care of her. So she had attachments. She knew she wanted to be a scientist from a very young age. Whereas Eve was something like 18 months when her father was killed, and her mother was plunged into a depression. And her grandfather died shortly thereafter. So she was very lonely little girl. But Eve then, I mean, Irene does become a scientist. Her mother and father both thought she took very much after her father, and she ended up working at Marie Curie's side as an adult. She sort of took Pierre's place in a certain way, working at Marie Curie's side, and was very confident and not at all interested in pleasing people. She was, in fact, kind of people talked about her picking her nose and being very crude and not saying the socially polite things. She had no interest in social conformity. Whereas Eve became a pianist at a young age, and her mother treasured that. In my novel, I have her associating her daughter Eve with her mother, who was a pianist, who also played the piano, I should say. But Eve expressed that she was very lost and lonely. It really interested me that Marie Curie, I'll maybe overstate this, but she hated journalists and she hated society women. And Eve became a journalist and a society woman.
Mm.
And I was fascinated by that.
Mhm.
Marie, of course, had a lot of patience and love for Eve. Eve's career as a pianist didn't work out. She had to abandon that. She didn't think she was quite good enough. But she was on the cover of Vogue as this beauty in Paris.
Mm. Mm.
But she did become a journalist, and she, like her mother, very courageously traveled. Marie Curie traveled in her little cars, the radio cars, Petite Curies. Eve traveled by primitive airplane to the fronts in World War II,
Mm.
and interviewed generals and reported on the front in the cause of Free France. So she
Mm.
had many of her mother's, ambitions
Courage.
and
Hmm.
courage. And
Hmm.
so I guess the way I think about Irene and Eve is that Irene uh, identified with her mother and father in this conscious way, and that Eve unconsciously identified with her mother's shadow.
Mm.
And that
Yeah.
yeah, and so that's why I have her falling in love with
Mm.
another man in the book. I mean, when she's a little girl, I have her falling in love with an adult man and having a crush on him and crying when he's not around because I wanted to convey that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I took that more as the absence of her father, but I see what you mean. Yeah,
Both, yeah.
yeah, and I think that the issues that surround mothers and daughters still are not very conscious in a general way. And all of the other combinations, mothers and sons, there's a lot about that written and thought about, and the sort of Oedipal complex is really more or less for that particular pair. And
Hmm.
then the fathers and the daughters, also a lot written about that.
Hmm.
Um, and then the fathers and sons, it's like a whole society is built around that.
Hmm.
That's what we call patriarchy. And
Yes, right.
then you've got the mothers and daughters, and there's nothing. It's like a dark hole
Yeah.
of lack of insight.
Mm.
And also, I think because of women's position in society being so sort of strangulated by stereotypes for so long, that mothers and daughters would often be in competition, and
Yes.
still even are, you know,
Yes.
because there's
Yeah.
not there's not an open field.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Did you notice anything in particular about Marie's relationship with her daughters that makes you think about this?
Well, what it was just the opening when she's at Hertha's. I mean, I did not, and maybe this was, left in your sort of the more or less colder view of her mothering, but
Mhm.
I didn't experience it as her being very interested in
Uh-huh.
in her children. Her interest seemed to be elsewhere.
Yes.
But then, when you're writing, and later in the book, you're writing the beginnings of the baby that eventually was aborted.
Mm.
Not aborted. I mean, well, it was. stillbirth, yeah, yeah, miscarriage. Um, I got the feeling then of Marie's fascination with becoming a mother,
Hmm.
but that actually is a little different from relating to the
Yes,
actual
that's
children, you know.
it's interesting. I have to think more about it because sometimes these dynamics are there before I know they're there.
Yeah.
But the way I was thinking about it more was that Marie Curie, in her humiliation and grief, almost didn't have mental space for her daughters and emotional space, and she was ashamed.
Mm.
Because she thought she had really harmed her daughters for good with the scandal, so that she was not capable really of giving them the interest and connection that normally, that she might. And I try to play that out a bit earlier in the novel when she finally is having this love relationship with Paul Langevin and feels his love. She does become a better mother. Right at that point, she's able to really attend to Eve and have these conversations with her and take her to have her music be listened to by a famous Polish pianist and kind of connect to her on a more affective level. So, in my own mind, that was sort of the dynamic I was thinking of, is that when she's connected, when she has love and work, she can be there for her daughters more.
Well, actually, I think that is fairly much the psychoanalytic perspective. I mean, it is a psychological perspective
Mhm.
because particularly the mother-daughter pair is sort of steeped in sameness, you know,
Mhm.
or at least the fantasy that we are the same. We might be actually the same person almost, you know, like my mother and myself kind of.
Yeah.
But then what allows it to differentiate and the two to appreciate each other is the presence of a third person. And, you know, usually that's the father.
Hmm.
And if there is the actual father living there, or someone who can function like that, say a grandfather could, then that gives other options also for a way of being. It's not another woman, you know,
Yeah.
and that's not to say that a woman can't take that role, but
Yeah.
it's very clearly there when there is a man there. And that allows the two women potentially to relate to each other as
Hmm.
separate individuals.
Hmm.
But again, within all of the issues surrounding women not being fully human, you know, even with the presence of the father, sometimes the women are still sort of partly seeking comfort in identifying with each other, the mother and the daughter.
Uh-huh.
But then also it turns out to be envious often because, you know,
Mm.
one of them idealizes the other. Sometimes the mother idealizes the daughter, sometimes the daughter idealizes the mother.
Right. Right.
And then it goes into envy very quickly. They're fighting with each other over who really knows something. So,
It's
um,
so interesting
yeah.
also because Eve Curie was the first biographer of her mother.
Huh.
She did that really quickly. I
Yeah.
wonder if she might have been working on it before because it came out quite soon after her mother's death, given the deep research that she did on all the stories from Poland. But it's
Mm,
completely idealizing.
it is.
Oh, absolutely. It makes her into this sort of creature who's, devoted to elevated causes, and other mortals can't understand her because of how little ego she has and how,
Mm,
selfless she is. And so it's
mm,
to me, it was kind of surprising that it could be that idealizing and still such a good biography, so full of life and
mm, mm,
the particularity of her mother's childhood, etc.
mm, mm. That's
But
interesting.
she must have felt the envy
Yeah.
of her sister as well.
Yeah. 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 Because the sister ends up being kind of like the mother
Yeah, and winning a
and
Nobel Prize.
winning a Nobel Prize. And so, yes,
Yeah.
that must have been tough territory for the youngest daughter, the younger daughter.
Yeah, Eve
Um,
married a man who then won a Nobel Prize for UNICEF, and she liked to say she was the only one in the family who didn't have a Nobel Prize.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Well, you know, I think that we've probably already talked about the suffragette movement and how it overlapped Marie Curie's life, but I wonder if there's anything else that you want to add that you feel that, I mean, I feel the novel is so important for women right now to read. And that's not to say that men wouldn't enjoy it, but you know, for me, it was surprisingly focused
Mhm.
relationships among women. And I wonder if there's anything else you want to say about the ways in which maybe you were affected by doing the research or writing it, or since talking about, the novel in regard to your own life as a woman, or, the way you see women
Hmm.
struggling with their ambitions and achievement, particularly.
Yeah. That's really interesting to think about. And I guess I want to say quickly first that Marie Curie, in terms of the part of the novel that focuses on her healing, that her stance of feeling, above other women, um, is part of what made her suffer so much, in the exposure. And so when she goes and stays with Hertha and meets these other suffragettes who are also bruised, who've been beaten down and publicly exposed,
Mm,
but they connect to each other. There is a kind of sisterhood there. And when Marie can start experiencing herself less as a fallen genius and more like an ordinary woman,
mm.
that's sort of when her healing can really begin. So I find that very powerful and important because I can identify with having wanted to excel as a student and identify with men because in my family that also felt like a safer bet. And so sort of seeing how that plays out, seeing how it ultimately undermines self-confidence, is very important for me.
So that was one thing was that sort of in telling the story or reflecting on it, or writing the book? I mean, do you know when you began to see, oh, it's this shift into being more of an identified with being a woman,
Mm,
being,
yeah. It's not that I hadn't encountered it and thought about it before, but I think spending time with it and writing that section of her healing and coming to understand what was happening there, because I didn't know what I was doing. I was writing that very intuitively, and I really could not, I had to like ask other people when they read it, why does she heal? What's
hmm
happening here? It wasn't
hmm
clear to me what I was doing. And
hmm
gradually this did become clear. So I think it kind of sank in on a deeper level for me.
Now, if you put that together in terms of, the way you think about the women that you help, you're a therapist, or the women that you counsel, or the women that you think about, um, I know you have sons, but you have granddaughters
Mhm.
also. Can you say anything? Like, what would you say? How would you say this is what you've learned, or here's the takeaway, or the insight, or the,
Well, I don't know how much of this is coming from the novel and writing and how much of it is coming from my being a woman with friends and my practice of working with women. But what strikes me now is that competition is still a really dirty word for women.
mm,
It's just, you say competition and it means everything that's kind of hateful and it's a very scary word. And women still don't like to talk about it openly, especially in friendships. It feels very threatening. And instead, people will talk more about friendship and connection and love. And also, they might have high standards in their work. But to have high standards implies a kind of purity and a kind of morality and a kind of, as opposed to being competitive or wanting something for yourself. So it does strike me that competition, and aggression and envy go underground. And when they go underground, it feels more threatening. It feels like someone's going to really get hurt. It feels like it's not, unlike men who are socialized to be competitive and expect
mhm,
to rib each other and say, I'm better than you at this and I'm stronger and I'm,
mm,
got more money. For women, still, I don't know if it's changed much. I guess
mhm.
there are centuries of conditioning, but it strikes me that being able to talk about that with a lighter touch and acknowledge it and feel it and experience our hatefulness and our competition and our wanting to be on top, we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, no, I love the way you put that. And also, if we could do that, we'd experience a deeper love, I
Yeah.
think, because in a way, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the distinction between Marie and Jeanette, where they do the brutal competition in a way that it occurs when women don't engage in real conflict,
Mm.
where they actually have to go through knowing each other. They dehumanize each other and then they tear each other up.
Right.
and they often do that behind their backs.
Mm.
But then the other kind of competition that you were talking about, the humanizing kind of competition, is like Hertha and Marie Curie.
Mm.
They're not, they don't have just the ease. They have conflict also.
Yes.
And but the love becomes really clear and
Yeah.
their devotion to each other.
Hmm.
And I think that is, I agree with you. I think competition among women and competition between mothers and daughters
Mm.
just has to be made more conscious
Mm.
in order for women to grow and develop. It cannot be left out of the story because it's accurate and it's tolerable and it's bearable to talk about it.
Mm.
And men, of course, not only talk about it, I mean, they learn in athletics really how to do it right,
Yeah.
from a
Yeah.
young age. They compete and then they celebrate together,
Right.
you know. So I do think, though, the relationship between Hertha and Marie Curie really does convey, what you were describing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so this is a great place to stop. And it's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Polly.
Well, thank you for doing this. And I hope a lot of people now rush out and buy the book.
I hope so
Uh,
too.
I hope so.
Here it is.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Javon.
Thank you.